I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to think about oracles from the trenches of being, people who are assessing them, measuring them. Probably from a lot of what we talked on the panel, what would differentiate them for new oracles? What kind of constraints would make them palatable for new markets? Um, but one kind of way that we think a lot about how the DeFi protocol market has evolved and is evolving a lot right now is that we've kind of moved from fully algorithmic models for protocols, so fully algorithmic in a couple different, many dimensions, but this two-dimensional projection is interest rates on the y-axis and liquidation price. So stuff to the bottom and to the left is fully algorithmic. Stuff to the up and to the right is user-defined. And so what we mean by user-defined is users generally are updating their positions. They have more active management. They can quote, like Uniswap v3, you can quote a price. In a lot of the new lending markets, you can quote interest rates you want your supply to be used for. You can quote for every market, where you want your capital to be used. So in these markets, you can have a lot more fine-grained leverage. So you can actually have better security, better risk properties, but the user has to be more active. And what you're seeing is kind of, if we cluster everyone, and one protocol that's missing in the upper right, which is on its own, is Ajna Finance. But we kind of see this move from DeFi in 2020 and 2021 is the lower left, which is fully algorithmic in terms of liquidation, fully algorithmic in terms of interest rate, to protocols that are adding isolation and adding sort of per market parameterization like Morpho, Euler, Aave v4, where there's a lot more granularity. And this granularity actually opens the world for a lot of new features for oracles. So as I'm sure many of you know, there's kind of this debate that has been on Twitter about, what kind of KPIs should I measure an oracle by? And so there's sort of this notion of the value secured by an oracle. So, what's the total value of the assets in the protocol that's secured by an oracle versus how much transaction value is an oracle being used to mark in. So the latter cases, suppose I have a perpetuals exchange, there's an oracle update every block. How much volume was that oracle update used to transfer? The former is more just like, what's the total amount of assets in the protocols secured? So they both have their flaws, right? In the total value secured case, the worst case is I have a protocol that has, $10 million of ETH in it, 0 transactions, and yeah, sure, the Oracle is making an update, but the Oracle isn't really changing the security at all of that system, right? The assets are sitting there, no one is transacting, there's no notion of loss or reward that's created from the Oracle. That's the worst case for TVS. The worst case for total transaction value is wash trading, where people are basically wash trading against the Oracle, right? So they both are sort of flawed. So in reality, you have to think about this in sort of like, at certain times you want to use total value staked, and at other times you want to use transaction value. So why does this matter? Well, when you're deciding on Oracle, oftentimes it's sort of a multi-dimensional kind of thing. So first off, there's security track record versus actual usage. I think you heard from Michael, like, on Compound, everything is so focused on Chainlink, and a lot of this is for this reason. The second thing is different stakeholder perspectives. Maybe some stakeholders are like, we want some new risky assets added really quickly, and you end up needing to kind of have newer oracles. But another thing that's really important is these metrics are really important for measuring the efficiency of new revenue models for oracles. So something we talked about on the panel was, how much money have oracles made? The answer is, if you ignore the tokens, none. Not none, but de minimis. And a lot of oracles are starting with new revenue models, like Oracle extractable value, so sort of capturing some of the MEV they create. But in order to measure how effective these models are, you really need to think about these kind of high-level KPIs. The other thing that's happening in a world where interest rates are more user-defined and liquidation prices are more user-defined is that you have an unbundling of oracles. So in all these different protocols, there are many risk managers like us who choose oracles based on what we think for that market is the correct kind of oracle, based on its latency properties, based on P95 prices relative to indexes. And so, as I was saying, there's sort of this shift from protocol-wide oracle consumption to market-wide oracle consumption, where different markets may have different Oracle providers, they may have different aggregation rules, may have different thresholds. And the risk tolerance that that different vaults will tolerate for an Oracle really depends on the responsiveness of the keepers and curators who are choosing the risk parameters. If they can respond really quickly, they might be willing to use a faster but more lossy Oracle versus vaults that don't have active curation may actually want to use a slower, safer Oracle, which, again, was sort of one thing that was mentioned in the panel. So just for those who don't know, I think one kind of very simple version of comparing different types of oracles that we certainly use, but I think you should think of is market oracles versus exchange oracles versus fixed rate oracles. So market oracles are sort of real-time pricing, but potentially are vulnerable to manipulation. I think the LRT, LST oracle is a great example of this. Exchange rate oracles are usually for stable assets, so staking derivatives against themselves, so like sort of roughly pegged, but maybe the overall pair is volatile. And you generally are sort of, these are slower oracles, and they're really good for these correlated assets, but they're again going to be delayed. They're not going to be perfectly on time. They're not going to have the real-time efficacy. And so generally, within these markets, if you look at how they're split, it's the higher risk markets will use the market rate oracles, and the kind of lower risk but lower leverage markets will use exchange rate oracles. And finally, of course, you have fixed rate oracles for stablecoin pairs. If you look at how liquidity differs between, say, WETH versus staking derivatives versus restaking tokens, you'll see that there's a much higher percentage of DEX volume, which is why you kind of need this sort of notion of proof of reserves and liquidity that was mentioned. So another thing that's kind of becoming more true, and this is sort of why I was mentioning this notion of people chaining oracles into coprocessors, is there's kind of this idea that like, oh, well, maybe I could automate a lot of the functions that these oracles have by doing extra computation at the aggregation step. And so there's this sort of naive thing that is like, oh, that would work immediately. Now, one problem is that works really well in normal conditions on average. But in crisis conditions, you oftentimes have to make very large jumps in parameters, especially when there's a depeg, especially when there's a hack to a liquidity pool. And those types of behaviors are oftentimes not quite caught by automation, and you have these sort of natural human intervention points. The second thing is what we call the parameter hierarchy, which is some parameters are purely about reward. Changing the supply caps in most cases actually is just really about ensuring that the yield doesn't get diluted too much. On the other hand, some parameters are really about pure risk, like liquidation thresholds, like at what price relative to where you enter, do you get liquidated, how fast you get liquidated. Those are clearly risk parameters. And there's this hierarchy where some of them you're sort of invariant to in normal versus crisis conditions, and some in which you're really sensitive, which of course is why I put these tweets here. And finally, I think there's been this kind of, especially in the restaking oracle space, of a lot of things that are like, well, why don't we just have AI kind of pick these types of things? And I think the real problem is in these crisis conditions, getting interpretable outputs that lets you figure out what the emergency parameter are is really hard. Like if there's a hallucination at the time of a crisis, you're kind of screwed. I'm just going to be quick here. One of the main reasons oracles have value on chain is they create MEV, right? They create some way of doing an arbitrage before or after. They create some type of sequences of transactions that some market participant can make a profitable transaction in. One of the goals of oracles is really to kind of minimize this MEV while maintaining the guarantees or invariance a protocol wants. However, the choices that are made by each L1 or L2 for things like safety and liveness, for things like block time, actually impact how well you can use a certain oracle. So in a blockchain that has a really low block time that's very reliable, you may be much more comfortable using a market rate oracle because you know your next update is fast enough, and then you know sort of some bound on the worst case loss over one block. But generally, if you have blockchains that are slower, so blockchains that value sort of safety over liveness, so they might have delays, they might have forks. Generally your pricing is delayed, so you have to be a lot more conservative, but it also means the MEV opportunities are sort of there's a higher hurdle rate for them. And vice versa for blockchains that value liveness over safety. So this is the last slide. So, I think one kind of thing to think about is how does risk management and overall look in crypto collateralized protocols over time? I think we're seeing this version of the world where people are playing a lot with how much they're pooling assets versus what oracles they're using. And that is where I can think the greenfield opportunity is for new oracles, is like really like segmenting protocols into parts where you can use different types of oracles to get higher leverage or higher returns. I think that the way these calculations and the management are done is also changing just because there's way more risks to cross-chain things, way more venues, you know, and things where there's like L3s like Hyperliquid, where like that's a sort of different bridge risk than a bridging between Arbitrum and Optimism. And finally, I think there's a lot of improvements to on-chain compute via coprocessors, as we talked about. Yeah, so that's it. I was a little over again, but not too over.